Another $300 million. That's what President Biden is sending to his Ukrainian counterpart. That's after Volodymyr Zelensky's trip to Washington to ask for more U.S. support in his country's fight against Russia. Biden is also pushing for several $billion more in aid, but a group of Republicans are pushing back, and the issue is one of several sticking points behind yet another budget stalemate. That could end in a government shutdown if lawmakers can't reach a deal by the end of next week. To discuss, I'm joined now by Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Newton, a former Marine who served in Afghanistan and a member of the House Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy. Thank you so much, Representative, for joining us. So where are we now? I wanted to reference, there was a CNN poll in July that asked citizens, it was conducted by SSRS, if the U.S. should give additional funding to Ukraine in the war with Russia. And it was split almost down the middle. Yes, 45%, no, 55%. It seems that after this meeting today, I'm curious, I know they didn't do a press conference, but where do we stand now in terms of the battle for funding for Ukraine?
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me on. This morning, when President Zelenskyy arrived at the U.S. Capitol, I was able to greet him. I shook his hand, told him face-to-face, Congress will be with you. And the truth is, Congress is with him. We have 300 votes right now to go to the House floor and approve $24 billion in further aid to Ukraine. The Senate would pass it same day. What is happening is that Speaker McCarthy is caving to his extreme right wing. He's allowing Marjorie Taylor Greene to write U.S. foreign policy right now, as opposed to putting the Ukrainian fight for the free world in the priority position where it belongs.
So you mentioned Speaker McCarthy. He has a faction of his supporters who are adamantly against this. Does that have enough power to actually prevent this from going through?
Ultimately, no. We don't have a math problem in Congress. There is a supermajority to pass the aid that Ukraine needs. And the reason there's a supermajority to pass the aid that Ukraine needs is because it's a good idea. Because for percentage points of the Pentagon's annual budget, we have cratered half of Russia's conventional military capacity. We have doubled NATO's border with Russia. We have induced increased defense spending from our allies like Germany and Japan. We have sent a strong message to the autocrat in the Kremlin, and more importantly to the autocrat in Beijing, that the United States stands with freedom and democracy and that might will not make right. This has been the highest return on investment in national security dollars in my entire lifetime. And President Biden has wisely guided this course of action. And Congress knows that, and Congress is ready to vote for more. But Kevin McCarthy doesn't care about what's right for the United States or what's right for Ukraine. He cares about what Donald Trump is going to tweet tomorrow. And Donald Trump has, for weird psychological reasons of his own, decided that he is sympathetic to Vladimir Putin.
So you're saying that even with that opposition, it still seems likely that Zelensky's visit changed some hearts and minds today. Does that seem like the case? Does it seem like he came in and was able to persuade people to move in that direction?
I haven't debriefed with the lawmakers who met with him one-on-one. I think the more important point here, though, is that actually Volodymyr Zelenskyy doesn't have to persuade most members of Congress. Most members of Congress, again, really on both sides of the aisle, understand the moral and strategic imperative to support Ukraine. I tell often my GOP colleagues on the Select Committee on China, on which I serve, that if they want to be tough on China, they must be tough on Russia. If you are weak on Russia, you are weak on China. Many Republicans understand that, but right now the tail is wagging the dog. Somewhere between 20 to 40 extreme MAGA Republicans are openly sympathetic to Putin's authoritarian and ethno-nationalist impulses and do not want to support Ukrainians as they fight on the front lines of the free world. But there has always been a fifth column in American foreign policy making. What's unique about right now is that we have a Speaker of the House who is caving to it. Not only can he not keep the lights on in our own democracy, we're heading towards a government shutdown, he won't even stand for democracy overseas.
There are, of course, legitimate concerns that need to be weighed. I wanted to play this clip from your colleague, Senator Josh Hawley, on Capitol Hill today. He met with Zelenskyy as well.
What the meeting revealed to me is that in the words of President Zelenskyy, the conflict is a total stalemate. The question, though, for the United States is, what is it that we are trying to accomplish, and at what cost? I mean, we're going to spend another $100 billion for what? Meanwhile, our southern border is in a state of collapse, and China's on the march in the Pacific.
So he mentions concerns about how realistic a military victory is in Ukraine, or if we are just funding a war of attrition or a stalemate. What's your response to that?
At this point in World War II, most of Europe was still under Nazi dominion. And there were people like Senator Josh Hawley back then who were offering capitulation and appeasement. History proved them wrong. History will prove him wrong again. Now, what Senator Hawley and Senator Vance are so good at is intellectualizing their arguments, that it sounds sophisticated. Let me tell you what they're really doing. They're afraid of Donald Trump. They're afraid of a MAGA primary back home. And they are drinking in the cult of personality that surrounds Donald Trump. And they are willing to dress up their confabulations in whatever language they need to. But what it comes down to is they're afraid of him. And if tomorrow he got a concussion and he started tweeting out in support of Ukraine, you'd hear Josh Hawley using big words again to describe why he was now in favor of Ukraine. There is not a serious intellectual argument on the other side of this issue that he is proposing right now. Again, he claims to be strong on China. He's not. If you're weak on Ukraine, understand that Xi Jinping is looking at American domestic politics and the fight in the counteroffensive every single day as a barometer of American resolve for our 21st century contest with a near-peer adversary in the Indo-Pacific.
He also raised concerns about oversight of the funds. And as I understand it right now, there have been some recent counterattacks from Ukraine further and further into Russia. But many of these attacks are being led, funding for the military from civilians, from social media influencers, from people purchasing military and drone equipment and sending it to the military. Will there be oversight of these funds if this is passed? Will there be some involvement from an inspector general?
There already has been. This, again, is another confabulation from the GOP, claiming that what we really need is more auditing, more inspectors general to oversee the funds. State, defense, the White House has a rigorous plan in place to ensure that the U.S. taxpayer is having their funds go to where they are directed. And indeed, President Zelenskyy has ensured that those funds are spent to highest impact. And when he has lost confidence that is happening, he has proven very willing to fire even senior officials. We cannot allow these marginal whataboutism arguments to distract us from the core imperative here. Ukraine is standing up against an autocratic, murderous regime, and they are demonstrating at a time when Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are claiming that the West is in decline and dysfunction, that no, indeed, freedom and democracy can be on the march again.
So where will the funds go? How much detail can you reveal about that?
The funds will go functionally to two different purposes. One is military aid. They need more munitions. They need improved intelligence support and tracking support. They need materiel. They need training. It'll also go to economic aid. Much of the Ukrainian government's funding to keep their own basic services operating comes from foreign aid. European Union has been generous. The United States has been generous. But we know that we're going to need to continue to keep their economy and government afloat.
I understand another aspect of that is targeting their air defenses, strengthening their air defenses. Some have said that this war will not end until it ends up in Moscow. Is that where you see this going? I know people have also predicted that we're going into this another brutal winter period. What are we looking at in the next couple of months?
Well, I don't know who has said that this war won't end until it's in Moscow. What is true is that air primacy is vital in war. No Western military, least of all the United States, would ever send infantry into 1, 2, 3 lines of entrenchments well fortified without close air support. As a former infantry officer, I can tell you that close air support is a difference maker. That's what we're asking the Ukrainian army to do, and they are doing it. They are doing it with unbelievable valor and tactical prowess, but they are doing it without air support. And the United States needs to make haste in procuring them the F-16s alongside the training for their pilots that they need, because the F-16s could be a difference maker. Let me just talk quickly about the counteroffensive in general. You asked where it's going. They're deploying a starve, stretch, strike methodology here, which is to say it's a huge front line that the Russians have entrenched. Can't attack all along it all at once. But they are probing for areas of weakness. As they find them, they are puncturing them, and then they are massing their forces to widen that puncture hole and cut the land bridge that connects Russia with Crimea, and thereby make the Russian position, particularly in the southeast of Ukraine, untenable. This is a good strategy. The Ukrainians are executing against it well, but it takes time, and it takes more munitions and more Western support.
I understand Poland overnight pulled out their weapons support. What does that mean for the overall picture?
It means that Poland is upset about competition with their grain industry because Ukraine has resumed grain exports and Poland is worried that it affects their own agronomy. Poland has been a terrific ally to the United States. They've been a terrific ally to Ukraine. They've been an early and forceful advocate for strong and unified action against Russia because Poland, of all countries, understands what Russia looks like when it is on the march against nations to its west. But Poland needs to continue to provide these weapons and support. And I do have confidence that President Biden, with other European Union allies, can help negotiate a reasonable solution to this.
This time period that we're in right now has been described as a critical time in this war. Why is that?
Every moment has been a critical time in this war. The initial offensive against Kiev was a critical time in this war. The successful counteroffensive last fall was a critical time in this war, and now is a critical time in this war. The Ukrainians have not demonstrated any diminution in their resolve to fight. What is going wobbly, though, is Western resolve to back them. And that is a decision that ultimately leaders here in Washington need to reverse. Speaker McCarthy, in particular, has a choice to make. Does he want to be on the right side of Donald Trump, or does he want to be on the right side of history?
You mentioned the spirit of Ukrainians to fight even without resources, because really right now it comes down to money, right? I mentioned previously these people who nonprofits or other organizations have come together to raise money, who are actively working in a very grassroots way to push these attacks further into Russia or counterattacks in the defensive to support the military. What have you learned about that aspect of things? Because it really seems like what they're missing is funding, and yet they're pushing forward. What I've taken from this incredible grassroots support for Ukraine, and I feel it in my own district, my colleagues feel it in their districts, and of course we see it in the people of Ukraine as well, is that so many people in the democracies of the West have been hungry for a galvanizing call to action. Really since 9/11 and definitely since the Great Recession, there has been this sense of moral ambiguity and listlessness amongst so many of our nations. And Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have preyed upon that. They have thought us weak and in decline. And this has been a wake-up call. This has been a moment where what is right is so clear, what is wrong is so clear, and what is at stake is so clear, and people have responded. I mentioned that CNN poll at the beginning of this segment, just from citizens, who it was about split half and half, but largely negative about our involvement. Why do you think that members of the citizens of this country should be invested in our involvement in Ukraine?
One, supporting Ukraine brings peace closer to hand. We have known for decades that peace comes through strength and that appeasement is a failed strategy. When you feed the crocodile, the crocodile stays hungry. And Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin will not rest until they have all of Ukraine, until they have Poland or Romania. And the stakes will get higher and the expense will be greater in blood and treasure if we delay the righteous fight. Number two, Xi Jinping is watching. We know that our near-peer adversary in the Indo-Pacific in the 21st century is going to be the Chinese Communist Party. We know that they don't share our values and they do not uphold the rules-based international order. The weakness that Xi Jinping does or does not detect in Ukraine is directly related to his actions against Taiwan and potentially a far greater and more destabilizing conflict. And then finally, it's the right thing to do. Americans have always wanted to stand with freedom and democracy. Now, we have been reluctant to engage in foreign adventurism, and particularly after Afghanistan and Iraq, I know that there is limited appetite. But I would remind people that we do not have troops on the ground in Ukraine. We are not fighting forever wars in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are fighting their own fight, and they are simply asking that we stand shoulder to shoulder with them.
You mentioned Afghanistan. Do you think there is a fatigue? I mean, you had your own personal experience, obviously. Do you think there's a fatigue from civilians in America because of those forever wars?
I think the forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have reminded the American public, and if you look at the course of American history, America has not liked to engage in overseas conflict at all. and it has always preferred to stay between its two oceans. And those two failed forever wars have reminded us that we should be incredibly skeptical of military adventurism overseas. And what is ironic about the GOP argument that somehow Afghanistan and Ukraine are related is, in fact, how antipodal they actually are. In Ukraine, we have a strong host country. In Afghanistan, we had a weak host country. In Ukraine, we have a clear mission. In Afghanistan, we had no mission. And most importantly, in Ukraine, no Americans are fighting. In Afghanistan, of course, it was hundreds of thousands. Totally different conflicts.
Great. Congressman Jake Auchincloss, thank you so much for joining us.
It's good to be on.